Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest is Patricia Paoletta, partner at HWG law firm here with a particular focus, I'm going to get this right here, digital infrastructure, trade, and technology policy. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Well, thank you so very much for being with us. I want to start with some easy questions. How did you get to the position you're in now? What is your career that kind of formed to this point?
Okay, well, I should start. I wouldn't be anywhere without your help, Mike O'Reilly. You know, of course, decades ago at this point, we worked together on the Hill, right? Energy and Commerce, well, then Commerce. But and before that, I had been at the FCC in the international office and had moved from the FCC to the U.S. Trade Representative's office. I was Director of Telecom Trade there, and then went up to the Hill after the 1996 Act was passed, and a lot of the councils, you know, were too exhausted to go on, and there was a big opening. Of course, you stayed on. You were diligently ready there to train the next crop of councils. So, yeah, and I was there for a couple of years, and then I went in-house into a tech company, then level 3. Now it's been rolled up, you know, successive acquisitions, but still alive through Lumen, so you're still out there. And then after that, I went back into the practice of law. I'd been an associate lawyer before my government service, so I was at another firm, and now I'm here at HWG. Been here for quite a while now, so I've stopped being a Rolling Stone. Well,
like a lot of people in DC, you described you spent time in the government and outside. Do you miss your government service? Was it easy to leave?
Government service is great, as you know. You've done a lot of stuff, including being an FCC commissioner, Senate staffer, House staffer. You know, it's fun, obviously, you know, and it's exciting, and you know, you're helping form policy. In your case, voting on policy, creating policy. But yeah, so it was great. It was fun. You know, children's tuition and other, you know, requirements we're calling, but yeah, and I enjoy what I do now. HWG has a strong technology practice, telecom practice, so I enjoy what I do. But yeah, government was great. It was a great time.
So let's dig into a little bit on the substance. You spend a great deal of your time, as I understand it, on international communications sector. Mm-hmm. From the macro perspective, does the world seem like it's coming together and commonality towards regulating, you know, communications practices or firms, or does it seem to be splintering and kind of heading in different directions? Are we heading to a world where the internet is in different, you know, shapes and forms based on region?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's fracturing so much as, you know, you have two major camps of countries, right? Some who want autocratic control of what their populaces see and consume, you know, content restrictions, and you know, you'll see that in China, Iran, certainly, Russia. You know, we won't say the BRICS largely, because you know, with some of those other acronym letters, right? There's some variation, but and then you have countries, you know, Western liberal democracies like the U.S. and you know, our allies in Europe and Canada, and who are more pro freedom of speech and all that, right? So you really have just two basic camps, and I don't see that those two basic camps changing much, right? And those camps have been around for millennia, right? And now we're seeing it sorted out on the internet, I think, as well. When it comes to actual tech standards, yeah, that's the actual hard work of tech standards has been done primarily by the industry, right? And there's certain groups like that, you know, your audience might be familiar with IETF, you know, the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IEEE, 3GPP on the cellular side. So, you know, I think those tech industry forums will be pretty stable, and even countries with autocratic orientation send their engineers there, right? So I think although you every now and then, and it hasn't flared up recently, you do see some countries, like we saw maybe China and even Japan, you know, decades ago, try to develop their own tech standards, but I think that they've seen, you know, that's a harder thing to do, right? But yeah, you still see instances of it, but generally, I think on the technology side, on the private sector, you do see some more harmonization and, you know, cohesion.
So you spend a great deal of time in the past preparing for previous World Radio Communication Conferences. This is the opportunity every 4 years where the world gets together and helps harmonize spectrum policy and sets the agenda for the next 4 years. What has been your experience in the past and how do you think that process has worked to date?
Well, an agenda for the World Radio Conference is set, the previous 4 years, right? And then, of course, and then that really influences the experiences of of everybody that's involved. In the past, we tended to have more. Well, every year or every 4 years is different, but last cycle we had more, what we would call it in the International Telecom Union, terrestrial issues, more spectrum for broadband or 5G. This year we have one issue. By this year I mean the next one, which is going to be in 2027. We have one agenda item, maybe one and a half, that deals with more spectrum for cellular. But this year it's very much focused on satellite, so that it will be a different tenor, I think, this cycle in 2027. And what we're seeing, and we certainly saw this at the last World Radio Conference, and it's been accumulating, some of this, but because of the U.S. really hegemony in big constellation satellite networks, which are lower to the Earth, closer to the Earth, so they can provide faster broadband than was previously available. There's a lot more threat and feeling out there by other countries that don't have, our strength in satellite and space. And so we're seeing a lot more agenda items going into this cycle that are attempting to throw sand in the gears of, the U.S. space industry. So it's going to be contentious. It's always contentious, but, when there was, because the 5G industry, such as it is, right, is a little more global in nature, and that you have, strong vendors out of Europe. Of course, you have Huawei in China. You had a little more dispersion of interest and, energy. But and obviously satellites all over the place. But the big innovators in space, to do these, lower Earth orbit, what some folks at the ITU, the International Telecom Union, call mega constellations. Sounds very scary. That really did come out of the U.S. So there's more us versus them, I think, going into this 2027 conference.
Talk a little bit about the U.S. preparation. You've been in different roles from the industry side of the equation. Most of it and the prep side is done at the FCC, but there is the component from the State Department and NTIA, the Commerce Department. How does that all work together, and does it work? Is today? Should we change that process up?
Yeah, well, it is complex. So your viewers should either tune in closely or go get a cup of coffee when I explain this. But yeah, in our structure, in our government, the FCC, as you know, right, regulates the private sector use, right, the satellite for broadband, cell phone, whatever, and a body in the Commerce Department, NTIA, manages the federal use, like DoD and FAA and NOAA. So they work with the agencies to get the agencies' views on what should be the U.S. position on a particular agenda item for a conference, and there's like 40 agenda items, so it is a complex process. Whereas the FCC, regulating the private sector side, they have an advisory council of private sector companies, and they try to get a diverse set of views, and you have to apply to the FCC to be on it. And again, they try to get folks from all over, broadcast, satellite, cellular, Wi-Fi, and then the industry negotiates what their recommendations for what the FCC should take in to reconcile with the government side of the house. And yeah, it takes a long time. It can be contentious, but I do think that process, we work out all the kinks so that by the time we go to our regional body to try to convince others in our hemisphere, so that's the North, South, Central America, and the Caribbean, to agree with us on what the position should be for our region. We've kind of worked out those kinks. So it's contentious, and of course anything that's contentious or big economic stakes will of course also go to the White House. Before then, or if there's disagreement between Commerce Department, NTIA, and FCC, State Department is supposed to be the referee, and they'll decide. But of course, like I said, a lot of the important issues go through the White House as well. But I'd say if there's any reform that is needed, we need to have an ambassador, a point person for the work sooner than we traditionally have done it. And the works have been going on since World War II. I say work, it shows my age, but these World Radio Conferences have been going on a long, long time. I haven't been involved since World War II, but we used to be the big cheese and the only big cheese on the block, right? Having basically helped the world subdue World War II and had the strongest military, which is of course still the case. But anyway, all to say, we've been a little cavalier in the last decades about how we choose our head of delegation to these conferences that are every 4 years, and we really need to be more focused this time and get somebody there sooner. Traditionally, it was seen, this is just kind of it's a political spot. We'll drop somebody in 6 months, right, as a special government employee. The federal government hasn't done that every time, and it just takes a long time to get the feel of all these agenda items. You'll have 40 different agenda items replete with lots of numbers that lawyers like you and me get confused about, like power limits and spectrum ranges and out-of-band emissions, a lot of technical stuff, let alone regional differences and where people are. So we need to get my reform suggestion would be to get a head of the U.S. delegation in as soon as possible. Now, typically the governments, whether it's been Republican or Democrat, like, oh yeah, we'll get around to that the year of the work, and they're always at the end of the year, right? I mean, they're usually November, December, a month long. And that's plenty of time, but I would recommend that we get somebody in there now.
So you rightly know that State Department's doing some reforms internally and procedurally. One of the arguments that's been presented in the past has been you can't pick an ambassador too early because then they can't be the special government employee, and you have to go through regular nomination process, and the nomination process can be difficult. There's a backlog of nominees in the Senate for consideration. I sympathize with those arguments, but there are you can move the legislation, you can move nominees when necessary. It seems like your suggestion is not unreasonable. Does it get anywhere? I mean, it's an idea that's been out there for a little bit.
Yeah. Obviously in this town, almost everything can be partisan, but who's going to be the head of the work delegation should not be partisan, right? Because again, you'll have had all this industry jockeying and negotiation and making sure that issues are sorted out, and ultimately what the positions will be a government decision, but it will be based on advocacy from the industry, like every other tech issue is decided, right? So you'll have ours and Republicans and Democrats all over the map, right? So I would think that one would be less contentious, it would be less contentious. But I think our last ambassador, in the first Trump administration, right, was Grace Coe, and she was sitting in the White House, right? So she was already obviously a trusted aide and had a very illustrious past, right? But I believe she went over to state, and she was never I don't think she was confirmed by the Senate as an official ambassador. She had the title, the honorarium title, or however they worked it, right? So I think there are ways around it, and it's not even, you're still the U.S., whether you're called, the janitor or, the special ambassador or temporary, whatever your title is going to be, other countries will know that you are the representative, for these sets of negotiations. So, I think the political
identification is the most important factor rather than the actual procedural nomination thing.
Yes, I think
identifying early enough so the world can recognize who's in control for leading the delegation. Is that fair?
Right, and that person can begin to meet bilaterally with other countries. They can bone up on the issues, meet with industry, obviously. And the challenge doing it too early is, that they get captured by one part of the industry, right? But that's our system, and there's ways to rectify that, and that you're going to have a lot of voices involved in that discussion, including the White House, right? So, you rightfully talked about the differences in the geopolitical situations that are happening. And this administration has been very aggressive in international organizations and may have a particular viewpoint on how they're going to go forward on WRC 27. But how do you, in your experience,
are conferees able to, or attendees able to leave the geopolitical issues on the outside and all work together? I've been to a couple and I didn't exactly see that. And I just wanted to get your take on someone who's been very involved in these.
Well, the U.S. traditionally, up until last conference in Dubai, was always the largest delegation, right? And China beat us last time. China had more people. They have more population to begin with than us. But anyway, so you have a very diverse U.S. delegation, a large and diverse delegation. And some folks, like, of course, I've attended as government back in our Hill days, but I've attended as a consultant, right? Or I'm on the U.S. delegation, but I'm representing other interests. So you have, and that's the bulk of the U.S. delegation is from private sector, or they might be private sector consultants who are retained by government agencies, thanks to the largesse of the American taxpayer with their budgets. So most of the people on the delegation are there for a particular issue, and they're there, following one or two agenda items. And that's, the State Department is fine with that, the FCC is fine with that, because those are going to be the kind of substantive experts that they'll go to when they need a little more, reminder over the issues, or, is this going to be okay to do this? So, and this is a month-long conference, so it's very dynamic and fluid. So I'd say the bulk of the delegation is not thinking about the broader geopolitical issues, right? They're thinking about, how do I get my clients' interests across the finish line consistent with the U.S. position, right? Everybody on the U.S. delegation has to cleave to what the U.S. position is. Hopefully you have prevailed, domestically before you go internationally. And if you haven't, you just have to, do the best you can consistent with what the U.S. position is. The U.S. government folks, of course, yes, they're mindful of the broader geopolitical issues, and that's their job, to be kind of more in tune to that and following that. And and often as a consultant, private sector, you get disappointed because even though your issue was really, really important, well, it turns out it was more important to appease this country in order to have some other non-related situation happen, right? So it's a geopolitical conference, but most attendees are there for their particular set of issues, for their particular tech players.
Well, as of this, I don't think it's official yet, but it does seem like China is going to be selected, maybe Shanghai specifically, to be the host city for WRC 27. Does that bother you at all? Does that cause concern?
Yeah, it definitely bothers me. And the current status is there was a vote at Council, the International Telecom Union's Council last month. And that's kind of like the executive committee of the ITU, of the International Telecom Union. And China shut down debate. They moved to shut down debate, so there wasn't even a fulsome debate. But and the U.S. was there, and of course not happy with that outcome. There is a process to go out and try to confirm a council decision if there's unhappiness about it, and that may or may not happen. But and I don't know what the U.S. is going to do. It was public. Commerce Secretary Lutnick sent a letter to the IT Secretariat shortly before Council that the U.S. would like to host. I think the concern with China hosting is, well, there are a number of concerns, but certainly surveillance is a concern. They are a surveillance state. And then there's the detention policies. We've seen in the news this week, right, that a U.S. employee of, I think, PTO was detained, and allegedly because he didn't put down, or she, the gender, I'm not sure, but that they didn't put down on their visa application form that they worked for the U.S. government, and they had family there, and they were detained. A Wells Fargo employee has been detained. I think she is either born in China or Taiwan. But again, had reasons to be there, I guess for work reasons, but they detained her. So that the detention policy is a concern to senior execs, I think, of U.S. companies. And again, the surveillance is a concern to everybody. Will we be able to access, encrypted VPN, messaging applications? I don't know. I assume the rooms will be bugged in the conference center. Like, where will we? The senior executives on the U.S. government, they will go off to the mission and presumably have secure communications in the U.S. mission. But I assume there's not going to be room in the mission for a 200-person U.S. delegation. And typically at a World Radio Conference, you have, my apologies, you have meetings, delegation meetings every other day. So that you know, there's a statistical or logistical challenge right there, but it's also substantive. Whoever is the host is the chair. So Shanghai does prevail, being the location. There'll be a Chinese chair. That Chinese chair also has a lot of influence over the vice chairs of the committees that are established to deal with different sets of issues. That the chair has a lot of prerogative in determining, you know, how long an issue can be debated, when to have the vote, you know, basically moving along the discussions. There are rules at the ITU on that, but they're very high level, and they don't curtail the end of the authority of a chair. And traditionally, the chair has had a lot of prerogative. So that, you know, there's a substantive concern as well, procedural and substantive.
Does it put the ITU in a very awkward situation in the sense that we have the head of the ITU is an American, deciding about the fate of the conference to be potentially in China, and the U.S. administration potentially has a different viewpoint and may exert its authority over, you know, as best it can? I mean, are we headed for a calamity, or does it get resolved before we get there?
Yeah, well, the head of the ITU, you know, American-born. She has been living in Europe for some time, but and she doesn't get to decide. I mean, the process, and there are rules on this, and I actually had a look at them last week. You know, if she were to ask for affirmation of the council vote, right, she would send a letter out to the whole membership, 194 countries. And then like 50% would have to, you know, well, more than 50% would have to disavow the council decision, right? But it wouldn't be her deciding. It will be the membership vote. And, you know, 194 countries is a lot, and most of them are in the global south, and only a handful have tech industries. The rest are kind of open to Chinese suasion. So, you know, that's not per se a process that the U.S. might prevail in. So. And I don't speak for the government, and I don't know what they're doing, but yeah, it's definitely going to be a challenging environment one way or the other. And but I think they're thinking of ways to how to mitigate those issues. I do think the tech industry feels we have to be wherever the World Radio Conference is held. If it's Shanghai, we'll need a lot of accommodation, and hopefully there will be a different location.
So as someone who's steep in ITU regs, you're reading the rules last week. Would you like to see ITU reformed? Or, you know, and if so, what would you like to see? There's been talk of doing the conference structure instead of every 4 years. You break it down. It's hard to wait for an agenda for 4 years. Communication technology tends to move faster than that process, than the Olympic cycle. What's your take? Is it as good as it can get, and you know, we'd love to change it, but it's not practical? Or are there reforms that we should pursue as a nation, as a government? Yeah,
I think there are reforms we could pursue. You know, time expands, or work expands the time allotted, right? And yes, you do. You know, again, this will get wonky, and I'll try to be not too much in the weeds, but you know, it's a 4-year cycle, right? And a lot of those cycles, or a lot of those years, are spent in studies, you know, technical studies. But it's not just by, you know, a group of brilliant experts off in a, you know, mountain top, you know, in their secure ivory tower. It's negotiated, right? And of course it's political, and you know, it happens, these studies happen, they're negotiated at the ITU. But you know, do we really need 4 years to do that? No. I mean, I kind of like your idea about having them more regularly. And yes, it can be kind of exhausting, because a month-long conference is exhausting. But yeah, we could tighten up that schedule. I also, and this is definitely wonky, I would love to see an occasional conference only to delete rules that are on the books that are obsolete. And I, you know, kind of saw that with Chairman Carr doing the delete proceeding, like rules that just don't serve us anymore, are just not, you know, are not functional. There is a standing agenda item on every conference to delete regs, or to remove your country name from you know, a regulation in the international telecom regulations, the radio regulations. But what we've seen that morph into over years is actually adding your name to a footnote. So it's, and we understand this, right? And you were a commissioner at the FCC, right? The energy and the money from industry, like you pay for what you want, right? The industry is not going to pony up a lot of money to delete yesterday's news, right? They want to spend money on getting their new technology identified, recognized in these regs. So it's, and it takes money to, well, it takes, for private sector to show up, it takes money. But we do need to clean up the regs. I like to see that reform. Another reform, there are 3 sectors at the International Telecom Union. There's a development sector, there's a standardization sector, and then there's the radio communication sector. I'm mostly involved with the radio communication sector, but on the T side, as we call it, the telecom standardization, there's just so many study groups. It's just unwieldy, and it's it's contribution driven, and it's mostly big tech companies with a lot of people who've got time on their hands pushing their technology to be blessed by the ITU. And you see, and who fits those bills? Okay, China, right? I mean, they've got a big tech sector because they've got a big population, and they have a very STEM-oriented education system. So we just have this proliferation of stuff the ITU does in the T sector, and I would like to see that shrunk if possible and curtailed. And it's often just, it's so referential to the private sector, right? They're just blessing technology that comes in from these private sector standards bodies, but they want the ITU moniker of, yes, this is an ITU technology. Because it is true, there are, out of those 194 countries, right, a lot of them do not have the FCCs with technical expertise or with the tech sector with kind of the money behind it to innovate. So they do look to the ITU for expertise and, gee, what should I do if I want to do, deploy X? And even some developing countries like Japan or some in Europe, or all of Europe really, it's easier for them to implement technology or implement new regulations on technology in their countries if it's been blessed by the ITU. But it's just been too much going on in the T sector with the ITU. And they've also strayed into things like AI and,
Should we curtail, like they seem to, on the D side and some other issues, they definitely expanded their mission. Should we try to, not we, but should the U.S. government try to push to narrow their focus and stay on mission?
Yes, I'd like to see that. And again, we're just one member, but we are, the U.S. and Japan are the 2 highest paying, dues paying members. So yes, I think we have some influence, and we should try to use that to curtail the work. It is contribution driven, so the idea is, you bring something in, we should be able to work on it. But it's just gone to too much, and it's difficult for the U.S. government to even field delegations to all these different, study groups and subgroups. Under the study groups, there's working parties, and it's quite a burden. And of course, again, unless you have a population of 1 billion so, and half of them are engineers, I mean, it's very hard to field bodies to all those different groups. You can't even keep eyes on them. But, State Department does a great job trying to track that. But yes, since we are a bigger funder than most every other country, we should be trying to bring some discipline.
You mentioned it, and I wanted to, you preempted me a little bit. Let's turn back to domestic issues. The chairman of the FCC Chairman Carr has an aggressive effort on deregulation, the delete proceeding. Are you pursuing particular items that you'd like to see done? Is that a good idea? And then I guess I'm interested in your take, since we've been through these rounds before, of do they tend to stall out? Do we have enough time to really get some momentum and delete what's necessary, that's really necessary out there?
Yeah, I think he's going to keep at it. HWG does have a number of clients in that proceeding, so I won't go into any details. But I think it was a great movement on his behalf, and I think he did it before. Even the White House also had a comparable executive order out there directing everybody to kind of look at what can be deleted. And I think you were there. You could probably answer this. Well, I know you could answer this better than me. I mean, there's so many obsolete regulations on the media side, and I think that's an area to see reduction. Obviously, the streaming video has more of a market share than traditional broadcast, and yet traditional broadcast and cable as well are subject to a lot more regulation than well, yeah, to the YouTubes and the other streaming platforms, right? So, I would think a lot of that area could be streamlined just because it's not, it's not needed. And of course, we've seen internet-based technology take off in some of the old, circuit switch telecom, and there are still of them out there. And the FCC is doing some of that, whether it's through the delete or not. I know they're trying to expedite copper replacement. I mean,
retirement.
Yeah, retirement, right. And I think that's a great effort. But and some of the newer technologies, which have a lot of the innovation behind them and a lot of money, a lot of investment, they're not as burdened with old books because they're new, right? So, so again, it's the same dynamic, right, that we've seen in you can say at the IT, right, that of course the energy is going to be on new, but I commend him for getting rid of the old stuff that just raises costs to mostly to companies that are already struggling in declining sectors, right? So I think it's great. I hope he keeps it up. You don't get the same kind of, commendation from folks around this town if you're just working on something that's not as exciting and vibrant and where the money is. But I commend him for that, and I hope he keeps it up.
Let's talk about a technology that used to be a little stodgy that certainly got more attention by the U.S. government for understandable reasons, and that's undersea cables. There's a big national security concern, both in terms of the potential for surveillance by other countries and the impact from if someone were to be destructive or attack the cables. What is your take? And I know this is something you spend time on.
Yeah. So subsea cables, it does seem, as you say, kind of, well, I never thought it was stodgy, but I understand a view that might think that way. But
I used to have the map on my wall.
Yeah,
so
that's good.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of international internet traffic, right, is carried over subsea, and over 90%, right? And of course, once it gets into another country, it might be delivered over mobile or to the end user, whatever. But yeah, even though the spectrum fights between cellular and satellite and whoever gets more play or more coverage because that whether or not it's a finite resource, the spectrum you can channel out of the air, right? You have to have rules so there isn't interference, and you have to have particular bands assigned to different to different uses, right? But yeah, subsea, it's just a question of laying the cable, right? But yes, adversaries can surveil them, right? If you put on a little listening device, or if you and you can sabotage it too, right? If a landing cable comes up, and the cable landing station traditionally have not been very secured because a decade or so ago people weren't trying to sabotage each other quite as much. So yeah, the U.S. and other countries, Japan for one, and others are definitely more focused on security of subsea infrastructure. And well, of course, we saw like in the Baltic Sea, right, with Russia and Ukraine combatants, cutting of cable. So yeah, it is a concern. The vast majority of cable cuts, and they do happen, right, comes from fishing vessels, right? They're not intentional, but it's definitely an important area. Yeah, the chairman has focused on that. They will have an order next month, right, on how to increase security, from the U.S. licensing side, and requesting more information about who owns, not just the cable, but also the electronics at the ends that actually make the cable, function as a transmission medium. So, they're trying to increase security on that side, and that, it's important. Of course, I also like to see more partnership between the operators of the cable and the government, and rather than more regulatory burdens increased on the applicants and reports and this, that, and the other thing, but just a closer discussion about what is out there, what's happening. That would probably be as effective as increasing the regulation about what you have to disclose and report.
You mentioned foreign ownership, and brings me to the idea of and dealing with, for your clients and others, what's your experience in dealing with CFIUS and Team Telecom and the FCC generally in maybe this administration and past, or how has that process changed this go around? Is it difficult to maneuver?
Yeah, well, I should say thank you for your leadership on that. I know as a commissioner, you were very active and dedicated in making sure that the CFIUS and the Team Telecom process was reformed and codified, right? Because it was not codified. And in the prior Trump administration, they finally did do a memorandum, right? So, sort of laying out what was going to be their process for both Team Telecom and I guess to some extent CFIUS. And if your audience doesn't know, the CFIUS stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. It is a different process and led by Treasury than Team Telecom. Team Telecom is not an actual official term. We should tell your audience, like don't go looking that up in the regulations, but it's a smaller group of agencies that look at just foreign investment in telecom infrastructure. It has improved. There's a little more process around it. I would like to see, and we do a lot of CFIUS work, but including outside of telecom infrastructure. So I think that process has been improved. A couple years back, this has been in the news, like farmland, right? Chinese buying up farmland. The last reform of the CFIUS regulations, included, land near sensitive U.S. military or other sensitive U.S. sites, and so there has been improvement in codification. With Team Telecom, I'd like to see more of a focus on investment by foreign adversaries, right? You still see, the reach that applies to all foreign investment, right? But we have plenty of foreign investors that are from trusted allied countries, and so it'd be helpful if there was a bit of a more expeditious treatment of that investment versus, investment from countries that we're less certain of. And the regs of the FCC require disclosure of all foreign owners up to a certain percent. And I guess that, it used to be 10%, and recently they proposed to go even to 5% and possibly even less. So, they're doing what they're doing, that's fine, gathering all that information. But then when it comes to actually negotiating the network security agreements, I think, the focus should be on where there are problematic foreign investors, right? Investors from non-allied countries or foreign adversaries.
One last technology question. Do you spend a great deal of time on the hottest topic in D.C., that's artificial intelligence?
Yes.
Today, the president's going to sign a number of executive orders on artificial intelligence. What's your take on what the U.S. government should do on artificial intelligence or AI, and what is that role? Do we need more regulation, more diligence? What's the answer?
Yeah, and yes, I do spend time in the hottest topic. And we do have an AI practice here at HWG. And I think it's great. I mean, the primary concern there, right, is energy, and he's doing what he can on that, and so kudos to him. The former administration, they, at the very end, they had rolled out an executive order encouraging data center builds on Department of Energy property, or some DOD, but I think there's probably more comfort level on DOE, but it had to be green energy, and that's this administration has said all of the above. Let's keep looking at everything, but the most affordable energy and the most plentiful energy, right, is from the fossil fuels, and the U.S. does fossil fuels cleaner than anybody in the world, right? And that is what is going to power these data centers. So I think it's great that their focus really is on making more energy abundance and facilitating permitting, green lighting more nuclear facilities. Obviously they have to be safe, but technology has advanced so much since the 3 Mile Island scare of our youth. I don't know, you were probably not even alive, but anyway, I think they're doing great. On regulation, you still have to have, obviously you have to have awareness of risky models, right? And that's, you don't want large language models being developed that can tell people how to build, bombs, right? Or massive biochemical weapons. It's, there are risks, obviously, to making AI so accessible to people that they can go out and build weapons, right? I think that's the concern. So you have to have some guardrails, but this president's focus, rightfully, and it's been amazing, right? Is focusing on let's keep the U.S. in the forefront of it. I mean, the most advanced chips were developed and designed here. I mean, the U.S. is already in the lead, but we got to do what we can to keep the U.S. in the lead, because this is going to change our world as we know it, right? And the U.S. has to be ahead of that, and it has to continue to lead. So, and the core issue is energy and data center availability. So I think it's great that he's really doubling down on this and and encouraging investment, right? And we saw that like week one with the Stargate announcement, and it seems like that's taken a little longer to get off the ground, but with certain partners. But the development is out there, and it's a much more permissive environment, and we need that because it's the demand for AI is only going up, and I think certainly your audience probably knows, training those models to be more effective in terms of the AI products requires a ton of energy, a ton of compute power. So we need more data centers that are going to consume tons of power, and it's great that it seems like to be an all-in process. He's got Department of Energy working on this. He's got Interior. He's got his trade people working on it. It seems to be the whole government really focused on ensuring that America can continue to lead in AI, which is rapidly developing.
Okay, one last question. As someone who worked at the FCC, there have been a number of changes. The agency's moved. You've had back to work requirements. There's going to be some personnel cuts likely. There's the general technology progression that's outside the boundaries of the agency's authority. Has the agency somewhat lost its luster? And I want to put it in a positive, it's a natural for agencies to have a role and then have a life and kind of cycle through. Have we seen a certain cycle for the FCC, or is it still as vibrant and important for key sectors in the American economy?
Yeah, I think it's still as vibrant as important for key sectors in that they're not going to find a clutch of spectrum engineers anywhere else. These are very technical issues the FCC deals with, and in licensing, satellite and even the terrestrial services, licensing cellular, Wi-Fi. I mean, you need experienced engineers in that, and you just don't have. I mean, the ways Commerce Department, for instance, is structured, or State Department, you don't have that group of engineers and policy officials who work with that, right? So I think, yes, there's still an important role, and back when you and I were kids, right, and again, he's younger, there was no AI, there was no this or that, and so some of the expertise on emerging technology is diversified, and the FTC has a key role on some of that, and that was under former Republican chairs where they gave up that power and basically gave it back to the FTC, right? So net neutrality I'm referring to. So I think that's great, because then the FCC can focus on where its strong suit is, which is on the technical regulatory side, and they have plenty of a backlog of issues. By the way, that they haven't gotten done, right? So they still have a role, but it's, in my view as a practitioner, it's great that they can have a more narrow focus and double down on the very many issues they have before them, in more traditional technologies, perhaps, but that are still regulatory, that are still engineeringly complex and require that super mix of expert policy official and an engineer.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you so very much for your insight. Very helpful on so many different topics. Thanks again.
All right, thanks.
Much appreciated.
Great to see you. Thank you.